Wow, I have Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst for 27 years, their leading expert on the old Soviet Union, guy who briefed three presidents, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan. And he's now, I guess, my correspondent in Moscow, and at an incredibly important time. The the leader of China, is on his way there, and it's the 80th anniversary, right, of the defeat of the Nazis, primarily by Russia, can't be denied. Russia of that time, Soviet Union, they were, lost a lot of people. Uh, what, somewhere between 30 and 50 million altogether. So, what are you doing there, Ray? And are you free? Are you okay? Or do we need to have get people to free Ray McGovern? Did they know you were a CIA agent?
Well, they knew that for decades, Bob, but my joy is to be with Oliver Stone and a couple of his fellow filmmakers. Oliver asked me to come along, as you know, and we arrived in time enough to speak, Oliver and I, at what we thought was oh, that's nice. It was a youth forum run by a really good countrywide organization called Znania, which is a word for knowledge. And then we learned that Medvedev, the former president, had spoken the day before. And sure enough, President Putin spoke the next day after we spoke. So it was quite a crowd, and it shows that the Russian leaders are really interested in cultivating history in their youth. And Putin typically spent about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, as I count them, uh, doing Q&A with these people, and it was just really fun to listen to. He made some interesting points. Well, we can go into that a little bit later. But my little talk, I strove for 20 minutes and went for half an hour. But it was a really high time for me, Bob. I had been there 53 years ago as branch chief for Soviet foreign policy, CIA. I had worked very closely with Jack Matlock, who was the Soviet desk chief at State Department in those days, later ambassador. And we had pretty much told Nixon and Kissinger, yeah, the Russians are really interested in coming to an arms control agreement, maybe several. And one of the impetuses is the fact that since Nixon and Kissinger were playing footsie with China, the Russians were hell bent on making sure that the Chinese didn't steal a march in developing good relations with the U.S. So that was additional incentive for them to actually conclude these treaties that we worked very hard on. The special contribution that my branch and my agency, the CIA, made, and this is worth remembering. It's doverai no proverai, trust but verify. Nixon said to us, "Okay, are the Soviets going to cheat?" And we said, "Don't know." Well, how soon would you know if they did cheat? Um, a week, maybe 10 days. That's good enough. Okay, it was good enough to have verification in 10 days. Did they cheat? Yeah, they, they cheated. Do we catch them in 10 days? We did. They put this god awful radar in uh, what's the name of it? Krasnoyarsk, way out in the hell, way out in Siberia. We, of course, imaged it and we told the Russians, look, this is an ABM radar, get rid of it. And they resisted that until Gorbachev came in and he said, okay, it's an ABM radar. And so he tore it down. So it was a really high experience. And the reason that I mention that now is that was a half century ago, right?
Well, you
Now,
said you were there actually. This was in 72,
yeah,
1972, right?
72.
And that was the same year that Nixon. Well, when did Nixon go to China? Was
He went in January of 72. It was very blatant what they were doing, playing the one off the other, because as we told them, they hated each other, the Soviets and the Chinese. We thought they might hate each other forever. Well, what do we know?
when you say
We
that,
didn't know.
that's not that's an important observation. They were both communist governments. and they were supposed to be united by, part of an international communist conspiracy to take over the world. And I know because I was traveling there at that time also, and you could hardly go from one country to the other without having the border people harass you and all that. There was no love lost there. So
Well,
that's
they were
not
shooting.
a frivolous observation. And now, actually, China Z is on his way to Russia. He's going to honor the 80th victory over the Nazis 80 years ago, and they're getting along better now than they when they both were communists. China is still run by a communist party, and Putin definitely he ran and defeated the communists after he'd been in the KGB, but he broke with it. He defeated them. Yet they're now getting along better, or is that an incorrect assessment? How do you read it?
Well, we had a lot of resistance in the first instance in the 60s, persuading people like James Jesus Angleton that this wasn't just a clever plot by the commies. That they didn't really hate each other. After all, they were both commies, right? And we were being taken in. And there were all kinds of people down in the ranks that wanted to play to that view. All right, here's a little vignette for you. There was a MiG 19. Now, this was 1968 around, okay, in Shanghai at an aircraft framing plant. And these fellows came up to us and says, aha, so you think that they're at loggerheads. Then why are the Russians giving the Chinese their latest model MiG? It's a MiG 19 right there on the apron. And we said, well, now that's an aircraft framing factory, right? Maybe that's a Chinese MiG thing. No, why can't it be? Because there's snow on the roof. Snow with it. Look, to melt these things, you have to have heat, okay? And the heat makes the snow on the roof melt. So it can't be the Chinese. It's got to be the Soviets. And you guys have been taken in. Guess what? We got a defector 2 years later in a place in Germany, and he was from this Shanghai area. So we asked him about, what about this Shanghai plant? Oh, don't remind me of this. We had to wear 15 overcoats, 5 overcoats. It was freezing there, but we put out those damn MiG 19s. So that's the kind of resistance we face. Now, uh, by the artful foreign policy of U.S. presidents, we've driven these two giants, no longer communists in any real sense, together so that, as you know, I've said before, there's 2 against 1, and that's really big. And so Xi Jinping arrives tomorrow. He's going to have a 3-day state visit during the celebrations of the 80th anniversary of the victory in Europe. And then Putin will go to the victory in Asia when Xi invites him. I think that's in September. So they're together, and so my presence there now is still hopeful because I see an opportunity that they can be détente or even rapprochement with respect to Ukraine. And I'm an outlier here, but I think that Putin should be taken at his word when, despite all the backbiting in the ranks in Russia, he says, look, I think that we can trust Trump. I think he's sincere. Whoa. And then, as I pointed in my speech, Lavrov, just 9 days ago, just 2 days before my speech, he says this to Face the Nation, worth repeating. We continue our contacts with the American side. There are several signs we're moving in the right direction. First of all, because President Trump is probably the only leader on the face of the earth who recognizes the need to address root causes, root causes of this situation, when he said that it was a huge mistake to pull Ukraine into NATO. As you know, they offered us a treaty and we said no. And you don't have to listen to me on that. Listen, this is what the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said. It was the 7th of September 2023 before the EU. He said, the Russians offered us a treaty They wanted to have a treaty arrangement to take into account their core interests. We rejected that. They said if we rejected it, they would invade Ukraine. And so we rejected, and then they invaded Ukraine. Ha 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 ha! This is after a million people have been killed in Ukraine and thereabouts. So that's the kind of leadership we've had at NATO up until now. I think NATO is on its way out. That's probably a good thing.
But I don't quite. Let me understand. We're getting some of these dates confused. You mentioned a speech you gave. That was in California when you say the seventh or whatever. But you're, I mean,
No, no, I'm talking about when Jens Stoltenberg,
yeah,
the
oh, yeah, no,
Secretary
no, I know.
General of NATO, made a speech before the EU in Brussels. That was the
Oh,
7th of September, 2023.
okay, okay. So that's history. But right now, what are you and Oliver Stone doing in Russia? Why are you there? What are you learning? Uh, and it must be odd. I mean, you spent your life combating the governments there. And how do people receive you? How do they talk to you?
Well, Oliver Stone is a big hero here. He's a big, people appreciate what he's done. They kind of like people who work with facts and real history, whether it's the JFK assassination or what really happened in Ukraine. So, I'm with Oliver, and I'm accorded a lot of the niceties that he is accorded, not only good food and drink, but meeting very important people. I just learned that I'm going to be able to join Oliver's group for the big parade and the celebrations on the 9th, and I'm delighted to hear that. Meanwhile, we're meeting with people every day, including folks that I would name when I come home. And it's just a good chance to plant ideas in people's minds. Now, here's one idea. When Putin was talking in the Q&A about his own family history, how his grandfather wrote a letter about how his grandmother was shot in the head. And as she died, this is during the war, shot by the enemy. As she died, she said, don't cry for me. Just keep on, all right? And then his father finished with a P.S. Slaughter those bastards. Okay. Well, Putin says, now look, I read that letter after I was a KGB high official for 20 years. I thought I had pretty much known everything there is to know. But there's some gravitas, there's something special about seeing this from a personal point of view. And, this is not exclusive to Russians. This is a good thing about Putin. He's not a nationalist in the sense that he's exclusive. He says all good people would feel this, and I felt it, and it gave me a different purview on what was going on. What he didn't mention, and this is, I guess, what I wanted to say, was his brother Victor Vitya, who was born during the siege of Leningrad. There was no food there. He died. Well, his mother had to give him up to a place that said they had some food or milk for babies, but he died. And when Putin was asked where his brother was, once in Leningrad, and Putin said, he's over there with the million other people who perished in the siege of Leningrad. Now, the reason I mention that is his brother died of enforced hunger because of a blockade. And I'm hopeful that I can put enough bugs in people's ears around here to say, well, lots of people in Gaza dying of hunger because of an enforced blockade. Can't we and China and others cooperate and put an end to this terrible mess that the U.S. is complicit in? That's a long that's a long reach, but I can't make a speech. I didn't make this other speech without mentioning at the end that we have to
Okay,
cooperate to put an end to the genocide in Gaza.
yeah, but let me be the journalist here, and so you could say that also about children dying in the Ukraine, and can't we have peace there? And what is your reading of what's going on? Why? I mean, here Zelensky said he's ready to accept a truce, and the U.S. wants it, and Putin is holding out. What's blocking it now?
Well, Putin has the upper hand, Bob. He's laid down the conditions under which he's prepared to negotiate, and they reflect to the fact that he's won the war. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
but
kind
that's
of a
what
big
Israel
thing.
Israel will say. They have
I'm
the upper
sorry?
hand. Israel has the upper hand with the Palestinians, and they're going to put their conditions, and basically
Yep.
it's conquest. I'm just saying, when is this peace in Ukraine that Trump promised when he was running? When is it going to happen? And there are a lot of reports that it seems to be bogged down now.
There's a lot of resistance in the United States for sure. I think the fact that Mike Waltz has been given the heave ho is a good thing. He was kind of a real neocon, and he's gone. Uh, it's going to take time, Bob, but I think that there's enough leeway in Putin's position, as well as in Trump's, that if they meet, as most people are speculating, at the end of this month, then there may be some progress. At least there may be some paths charted to make sure that there is finally a ceasefire and the two sides stop killing each other. That is what Trump professes to be his main aim, and Putin too. I think they can agree on that because Trump knows he's got a very weak hand, and that vice versa with Putin. He's got a full house as far as poker is concerned, and he's going to insist that his terms be honored. And the trick will be to give Trump enough so that they can put lipstick on the kind of pig that's going to be the agreement there in Ukraine. But I do believe that both leaders want this to happen. It's going to take some time, and Trump has a lot of opposition, but I think he can force it through.
But I mean, getting back to the heart of the matter here, uh, what sustained? I mean, yes, you mentioned nationalism of all kinds. There were plenty of Ukrainians who died in World War II. They were in part of the Soviet Union
Right.
and so forth. And why, after all these years later, we're still having these grotesque, costly wars? And you can just say, 1 million die now, and 4 million died in Vietnam, which we just had the anniversary. And this war, who knows what's happening? It could be the ethnic cleansing of 2.3 million people, Palestinians in Gaza, and let alone the Palestinians who live in the West Bank. So what that war, the Great War, that was supposed to end all wars, and we've had nothing but wars since, and actually incredibly bloody wars. What's going on here, Ray? You're the expert on all this. Give us the deeper truth.
Well, in simplest terms, we promised in 2008. Oh, actually, we promised in 1990 not to extend NATO 1 inch to the east of the East German border. We've doubled NATO in size and then added a few more. That was the first, what the Russians see as betrayal. Then there was the most blatant coup in history, properly identified as such, since it was advertised 2.5 weeks before on YouTube, naming the coup participants and who would be the new leaders of Ukraine. Victoria Nuland, you know that story. So that was the deception on the Maidan, where Putin was told, "Oh, don't worry about it, Yanukovych. He's just we're going to have a delayed elections," and of course they sent in the shock troops. So that was number two. Number three was the Minsk Accords, which were supposed to solve the problem of regional autonomy for the Donetsk and Luhansk and the Donbass. Uh, the French and the Germans have sort of laughed at that, saying that was never real. That was just a delaying tactic to allow NATO to build up a very strong Ukrainian army. And then finally, when Putin sent his troops into Ukraine, okay, uh, we know by all the evidence, and I've done lectures in your class, Bob, that it's really false to say this was unprovoked. And the one thing I can show you is that the day after the invasion, Zelensky sent his best friend to negotiate an end to it in Belarus with the Russian representatives, and then they moved to Istanbul. No, not many people know that. In other words, what Putin was trying to do with this full scale invasion of just 90,000 troops was to scare the bejesus out of Zelensky, and it worked. They did an agreement in Istanbul. It was ready in April, just 6 weeks after the invasion, and the U.S. and the British put the kibosh on it. And so these are the betrayals. This is the thing that Lavrov is saying now. Look, now they finally understand that just like we didn't want Soviet missiles right off our shore in Cuba, it's very similar. We don't want American missiles or NATO missiles right off our border, our very long border in Ukraine. They understand that now. We can make a deal. We're doing gradual steps, says Lavrov. And as you know, despite
So
all the
what?
blockages, I think it will happen.
So what's holding it up? Is it going to happen? I mean, well,
Well,
first of all, let me ask you.
I think
You're
Trump
going
has
to.
unrealistic expectations. He thinks by force of will he can make things happen. That's not the case. And once they start negotiating in earnest, Witkoff has been there 4 times. I think maybe one or two more times, and then Trump and Putin will meet, maybe as early as later this month. Will there be an immediate agreement? Well, I don't know, but it will depend largely on whether the Ukrainians will realize that they lost, and they can realize that the other Europeans don't have a prayer of substituting the kind of support that the U.S. has been giving them for the last 3 years.
So is this your first time in Russia since when?
No, I've been here several times, but but I just get around now. We're here for 2 weeks, and I tell you, Bob, 1972 and 2025, I just can't believe what I see. Uh, the city is very modern. People are in good shape. I understand most of the cities are like that. I'm going to try to get out into the countryside before I leave, but I understand that's not so bad either. So it's been a miracle. I mean, when you have the perspective I have of 53 years from 72, I travel around quite a bit in 72. And it's very different now. The whole place is like a modern civilization, more modern than most cities in the United States.
So you're Russian. People understand you're Russian.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm glad you asked that. I thought I would try to put a human look on the end of my speech there on, what was it, the 29th. And so, with all this victory speaking and how we beat the Nazis, and I thought it was important to acknowledge the grief, the sacrifice, the pain. And there have been some beautiful Russian poets that have spoken to that. Actually, Putin spoke to that in the Q&A. So I recited a brief Russian poem by the Russian poet Nekrasov, the poet of Ruskoy Skorby, of Russian pain. And guess what? It went over well. Well, you and I have talked about how in the old days, when Khrushchev or even Stalin would make a speech in Pravda, there'd be a little italicized thing at the end of every 3 paragraphs. Бурные аплодисменты, все стоят. Stormy applause. Everyone stands up. Well, the applause was not stormy, but everybody stood up after this poem. Now, the poem is a real human poem. I can recite it for you if you like, Bob, or I could just write it for you later. But it's a poem that acknowledges, and it coincided with Mother's Day here. It acknowledges that paying attention to the horrors of war, uh, there are people who suffer more than anyone else, and those are the poor tears, the sincere tears, uniquely sincere tears of poor mothers whose children have perished on the bloody battlefield. They don't forget their children, just like a weeping willow tree can never can never raise its branches. It sounds a lot better in Russian.
Do you remember a few sentences of it, or
Yeah, sure, yeah. Ужас is the word for horror. Okay, it's almost like onomatopoeia, ужас. So the title is Внимание ужасом войны, paying attention to the horrors of war. Внимая ужасом войны при каждой новой жертве боя, мне жаль ни друга, ни жены, мне жаль ни самого героя. Увы, утешится жена и друга, лучший друг забудет. Но где-то есть душа одна, одна до гроба помнить будет. При лицемерах наших сил и всякой пошлости и прозы одни я в мире подсмотрел святые, искренние слезы, то слезы бедных матерей. Им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой небе, как не поднять плоху шаиве своих поникнувших ветвей. That's the whole thing. When I said святые, искренние слезы, those are sacred, sincere, heartfelt tears of mothers who lose their children on the battlefield, and or in the siege of Leningrad, like Vladimir Putin's mother lost, or right after the baby was born during the war when the father was away. There was an elder brother named Albert. So it's not only Putin; it's millions and millions of Russians. All of them have had this experience, and if everything goes right and there are no Ukrainian drones hitting away at people in Moscow, we'll have the march of the Besmiernia Polk, the everlasting or the Besmir without death, the eternal regiment, and those are people who hold signs of their uncles, their grandfathers, their great grandfathers, and millions come out. They do in Petersburg. I think they will in 2 days in Moscow as well. It's quite a sight, and it's a reminder that the Russians have been through this. We have not. Okay, we've got two oceans. Lavrov has warned us that those two oceans don't amount to much anymore, but still, we don't have the experience of what they experience. And so when they look on that, they say, well, my God, these people don't know from nothing about war. We better be really careful and not provoke them, but chip away at what they're trying to do, a trit, and not go take Kiev right off the bat.
what do you mean it will take Kiev off the map?
Pardon?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that the Russians are capable now with their buildup of forces. They've got over 1.5 million men ready to pounce on Kiev or Kharkov or
So
Odessa.
they would
They're
be
not going to do it.
oh,
These are Slavic peoples. They don't want to ruin their cities, and that's why I say there is room for negotiation here. Uh, Putin himself, 2 years ago, nobody pointed this out because it was at the end of one of these 3.5 hour Q&As. This is what happened. Somebody said, now,
yeah,
Mr. President, I would like to travel to
oh, we
Odessa.
lost you again.
And I'm wondering, would you suggest that I apply for a...
You just cut out on me there for a second.
Oh, okay. Can you hear
You
me
said
now?
yeah, you said
Yeah.
Putin.
Okay. He says, Mr. President, I'd like to travel to Odessa. I've always wanted to be there. Do you suggest that I apply for a Russian or for a Ukrainian visa? Pretty
Who
quick
is this?
question. So Putin says, oh, yes, Odessa, Odessa. Catherine the Great, the Russian beautiful city. And then he says, now, Odessa could be a яблоко раздора, that's an apple of discord, or it can be a way of getting together and surmounting seemingly insurmountable obstacles. That was an offer. That was 2.5 years ago now. Okay. I put it out in what I wrote. Nobody read what I wrote, But when you talk about it could be a Yabloko Razdora, it could be a apple of discord, go back to the Trojan War, or it could be a way of that means, in my view, Odessa is up for grabs. They could make it an international city so that Ukraine is not reduced to a farmland for the rest of Europe, but has access to the sea and can be a viable nation. I think with the proper understandings concluded, I think Putin could live with that. The Russians could live with that. And remember, they do consider Ukrainians their brothers and sisters.
Yeah, and the Ukrainians lost plenty of their children in the Second World War. I mean, that's the horror of this, right? I mean,
Bob, I can't hear
Ukraine
you.
Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union at that point, and
Sure.
they
Yeah.
were sacrificing their young. I wanted to wrap this up by here's you and Oliver Stone. Now you joined the military, volunteered, right? Coming out of college, so that was what in 19 was after the Korean War.
1961.
Yeah, and that was pretty tendentious time. So and this was to counter Soviet power. You enlisted, and then after your service, you joined the CIA. And I want to get it back to this personal moment that you're there. And I must say, Oliver Stone, I just read a terrific interview he did with the Hollywood Reporter about his own Vietnam experience. And he was like you, a believer in what he'd been told about the Cold War. He thought he was going to Vietnam, where he had been a teacher in South Vietnam. Uh, then he went back and volunteered and did 2 tours of duty, right? I think, and was wounded, twice wounded. And you guys are there. It's very odd. You were people who now Russia's not the Soviet Union, but you and Oliver, your lives have been wrapped up in first believing and then challenging the whole idea of the Soviet Union as our enemy, and by extension, Vietnam, in Oliver's case, going there. What is it like? Let's wrap this up there because I'm hoping to get you back on after Z comes to China from China and your historic meetings. Hopefully, you'll talk to me again, right, in a couple of days.
Sure.
I mean, you're my bureau there. You're the Sheer Post bureau, and
Bureau chief, huh? Make me bureau chief, Bob.
oh, I can't pay you, Ray, but if you're willing to be bureau chief, I'll make you bureau chief. You want me to send you a card? But seriously, you guys are there. It must be very emotional because in an earlier part of your life, you both volunteered to fight against
Yeah.
communism. Now, Russia is, I have to keep repeating, is not a communist country, quite the opposite. China is. But how did your lives end up where the two warriors, which both of you are, you've spent your life as a warrior, being in the CIA as a warrior, but you also, as I say, were in the
Yeah. Well,
non.
Bob, one of my blessings is the fact that I was never trained to hate the Russians. I was trained to understand them, to be steeped in their history, to learn their language quite well, to go to liturgies at Fordham University where they had Eastern Rite liturgies there with the beautiful music and all. And so, yes, I was a child of the Cold War, but I knew a lot about Russia when I entered the CIA. And yeah, I learned a lot of stuff. I remember when I went to my first branch chief after reading a lot of Soviet propaganda against Germany, and I said, George, yeah, I think the Russians really are scared of the Germans. And he put his feet up on the desk and he looked at the fluorescent lights and he says, Ray, you're telling me the lights are on. Okay. So I learned not only to read their stuff carefully, but to realize that they had legitimate grievances. The war could have ended in a different kind of way had not Harry Truman succeeded FDR. There were a whole bunch of things that could have happened. So you learn these things. And of course, the big divide, of course, was when the Soviet Union fell apart. And I think I told you before, Bob, when that happened, I was 50 years old. And I was able to retire early at 50 if you had spent a lot of time overseas, which I had. So I clapped myself on the back, said, "Mission accomplished, Ray." George H.W. Bush is talking about a peace in Europe from Vladivostok to Lisbon. It's going to work. You can go work in the inner city where I had been volunteering. And I did. And then a decade later, I saw that my former colleagues had been suborned into falsifying intelligence to justify a war of aggression against Iraq. That was too much. And then I started writing and speaking, and the rest of the story is, well, 25 years later, I'm still doing it. And yeah, is it emotional for me? I never thought I'd get back here under such circumstances. It's been a long haul. I don't know if I'll get back ever again, but to the degree I can still do stuff, to the degree I can make speeches before Russian youth, I'm just very grateful for that opportunity and happy that Oliver thought it would be a good idea to take me along.
And Oliver is in the same position. I mean, it was very moving. And I'll talk to Oliver about this, but I found this piece very moving because he said, "Look, I was teaching there in South Vietnam when it was under, well, it was after Diem, but it was certainly the U.S. Engineered South Vietnam, and the breakup of the country after the we moved in to replace the French, and he believed in it. And he believed when he went over to fight, just like Ron Kovic, who was the subject of his movie Born on the Fourth of July that Oliver made. But now, obviously, Oliver's Platoon and Heaven and Earth, his third part of the trilogy on Vietnam, and you know, really, there's something incredibly American about that journey of innocence, but also as with Mark Twain and others, the reckoning that your country could get it wrong, and that the ultimate loyalty to an American ideal was to speak about of the truth, which after all is what Oliver Stone did, what you've done. But I wonder how you explain this to Russian audiences, which must be made up of people who have lots of different views about communism, about the Cold War, right? This is
Oh, sure.
a country that's been through a lot, right?
Well, they have big ideas about the CRU, which is the CIA, right?
Yeah.
I start off with some points against me. I think what's a big advantage is that my pronunciation is real good. As long as I can find the words and come up under a thick layer of German, then that's good, and that's a real struggle. So after 2 weeks, I may be a little bit better, but I still won't be where I used to be when I taught Russian. Let me say about a word about Oliver. This is a
Where did
little
you teach?
vignette
But just let me. Where did you teach Russian?
at Fordham and at the University of Virginia.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah,
Oh,
not
well,
very long,
so tell me about
but
Oliver.
Oliver was on guard duty before the embassy in Saigon or the headquarters, and I said, "Whoa, where were you at Tet?" And he said, "Well, I lucked out. The sergeant and I got into a big fight. I didn't like sergeants. I don't like discipline. I can identify with that." He says, so he said, "Get out of here or go to the brig." So I went out into the field where it was much more comfortable for me. 2 weeks later, boom, everything fell apart. They got into the embassy. Who knows what had happened to me if I was doing guard duty then? So Oliver is the real deal. And you speak correctly, Bob, about how many of us were misled into thinking this was a threat from communism when in reality it was a civil war that Ho Chi Minh had already won and then was sold down the river in 1954 by the Soviets as well as the rest of us. So it was very complicated history. My brother, 3 years younger, was at Princeton, and he knew the story, and he tried to persuade me, but it took a while for me to come around and realize that this was really crazy. I salute you, Bob, because you know it years before I did. But Oliver and I had to learn the hard way. He the real hard way. I didn't get any Purple Hearts.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up on this. So you're probably tired there now. It's late.
Well,
Uh,
it's 2:12 here, local time in the morning.
oh, in the morning.
Yeah,
Oh my goodness. So
we're 10 hours
okay,
ahead of you.
okay. But I'm gonna. Can we talk after Z comes? He's coming
Of course, yeah,
tomorrow.
I'm looking forward to it, Bob. That's why I hoped that we could do it tonight. I'm glad we did. Thanks for the
Okay.
invitation.
So let me know the next time you're free. And my
Okay.
Moscow bureau chief, and for sure post. Wow.
Yes,
Go.
sir. I hope you give me a good evaluation.
We don't even have a bureau chief in LA, but okay, a bureau chief in Moscow, we'll give you credit. And so, yeah, see if you think you might have some time tomorrow or next day or what. You'll let me
I'm,
know.
I'm sorry?
You'll let me know when you're ready to
Yeah,
fly.
it will probably be a week from now.
Oh, but isn't Z coming in 2 days?
Uh, 9th is when we celebrate here. 8th
Uh,
is where others do.
Oh, okay,
I'll be coming home on the 11th, and I'll be ready to go on the 12th.
okay. But I'd like to get another report from Moscow, so let me know.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
let me see what can be done here.
All right. Hang
I'll
in
get
there,
back to
Ray
you,
McGovern.
Chief.
Yes. Okay. I'm gonna
Thanks.
hang up. But wait.